The worm gear set consists of the spindle, with the worm wheel gear and spindle lock attached, and the worm gear. The gears will wear over time and eventually fail. A failed gear will usually give warning with a clicking sound. You might also notice excessive gear lash. Often when the gears give out completely, the motor will spin, but the blade will not. Replacing the worm gear set is a repair that you can do yourself, and I'm going to show you how. I'll begin by removing the blade from the saw. Now I'll remove the inner flange and the guard. The guard is secured by a helical retaining ring, and I'll use a pick to remove that. Next, I'll remove the guard bumper. Next, I'll remove the base clamp lever from the back of the saw. This will let me rotate the base far enough away from the guard so that I can remove it. Now remove the oil fill bolt and drain the oil from the gearbox. Next, I'll remove the guard flange plate from the saw. Next, I'll remove the front cap from the gearbox. Now I'm going to engage the spindle lock, just as if you're removing the blade, and remove the nut on the end of the armature shaft. Now I'll remove the motor brushes. Now remove the 4 bolts that secure the motor half of the saw to the gearbox. And now I can separate the rear half of the saw from the front. Now I'm going to place a pointed punch in the indent on the end of the armature shaft and tap it out. Now I'm going to remove the base from the saw. Now I can remove the spindle and wheel gear assembly. I'll place a screwdriver underneath the plate and gently pry it out of the housing. This is a thin casting, you want to be careful not to break it. Now I'm going to remove the access cover. The first thing I need to do is take the bearing that we removed and place it back into the housing, just a small amount. You'll notice that there's two different shields on the bearing, plastic on one side and metal on the other. The metal shield should be out. So I'm going to place the bearing into the housing and tap on it until it just seats. I don't want to install it all the way. I just want it seated into the housing. Now I can reinstall the worm gear. Now insert the gear back into the housing. You'll notice that the shaft on either end of the gear is a slightly different length on each side. I want the short side to be back towards the motor. Place this into the housing between the bearings. Again, I've got the short end pointing back. Now I'll tip this back up onto my table and use the socket again to install the front bearing until it just touches against the gear. Now I can install our rebuilt spindle and gear back into the housing. You'll notice on the flange that one side is shaped a little differently from the others, and that should go down. Now I can reinstall the access cover. Now reinsert the armature. Make sure that the O-ring is aligned with the groove on the armature shaft, and as you insert the armature into the worm gear, make sure that the splines line up with the splines on the worm gear. And I'll replace the front cap. Now I can replace the blade guard flange. Again, make sure that that tapered edge is on the bottom of the saw. Now I can reassemble the two halves of the saw. I'll secure the armature shaft with the nut. Now I can secure the armature shaft. First, the thin metal washer, and then the nut. I'll reinstall the rear guard screw. And now I can reinstall the brushes. And now I'll reinstall the blade guard. And the guard bumper. Next, I'll reinstall the base. First the star washer, followed by the nut. Now I can reinstall the cam lock for the rear portion of the guard. First, the flat washer. Next, the nut. I'll tighten the nut finger tight and then install the lever. I want to position the lever so that when locked, it's pretty much horizontal, and that looks good. And now I'll reinstall the retaining ring. Now I'll reinstall the blade. First the inner flange, followed by the blade. The outer washer. And the bolt. And I'll finish up by adding new gear oil to the gearbox. The oil should come up to the bottom of the threads when the saw is sitting level. You'll need to add a little at a time, let it settle, and then add more. And that looks good. After running the saw for a short time, maybe half hour or an hour, it's a good idea to double check the level of that oil, as it will work its way up into the cap and settle into other portions of the gearbox, and it may drop a little bit.